Hello, everyone, wherever you are in the world. We're going to give everyone a minute or two to get in the room, and then we'll get started. Is everyone still joining us? We're just giving everyone a minute or two to get into the room, and then we'll get started. Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar. We're very excited to have Ekata, a MasterCard company here, and Alex Hall, who introduced themselves in a little bit from Dispute Defense Consulting. We are going to be diving into how to balance the customer experience with fraud prevention, one of the hottest topics out there right now. Really appreciate everyone joining us. We have a great event planned, and we're going to get started. So just a quick word here about Merchant Fraud Journal. For those of you that haven't attended any of our events previously, founded by two former fraud prevention industry professionals, independent, unbiased publication. And our audience includes anywhere from SMBs all the way through to large enterprise company thought leaders. And we really pride ourselves on being able to pool knowledge across the entire ecosystem of fraud prevention, to bring everyone the insights and move the conversation forward. We have a lot of channels you can check us out on. Please check out our podcast. You can hear more of my amazing voice if you can stand it. The Catch a Fraudster, you can get it on all of the different platforms, wherever you listen to, absolutely any of them, it's on there. So you can just give us a look there. And then we also have a Slack group, which I will be sharing the link to at some point during the webinar. And of course, we have a LinkedIn page. We hope you'll follow us and join the conversation. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our two panelists. They are, like I said, Megan and Alex from Ekata, a MasterCard company, and Dispute Defense Consulting. So take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Bradley. And thank you all for, taking time out of your day in the middle of summer to join us for this webinar. My name is Megan Surratt. Like Bradley said, I am in product marketing at Ekata with over 5 years of experience in identity verification and payments. I work primarily with e-commerce companies to help develop account opening solutions that are really focused on the balance between, stopping fraud without adding friction. Alex, anything you'd like to say to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Bradley, thank you for the great introduction. Megan, it's an honor to be here with you. For everybody else, my name is Alexander Hall. I'm the owner of Dispute Defense Consulting, and I have 15 years of experience relative to fraud and fraud prevention. I work with service providers, publications, and merchants in order to implement and develop and deploy holistic fraud prevention strategies, leveraging automation with vendors such as Ekata. Yeah, it's great to be here. As Megan said, thank you guys for carving time out of your day to be here. We got a lot to discuss, so let's go.
Yes. Yeah, and before we dive in, I just want to do a quick recap of what we're going to cover today. And to give you all an idea of what we have planned, Alex and I will have a conversation about this for 30 to 40 minutes. So we'll be leaving plenty of time at the end for questions, and we'll definitely wrap before that hour mark is done, so you can get back to your days. And then, yeah, what we're going to cover today. So we're going to kick it off to kind of set the table by looking at the current state of e-commerce fraud. We'll look at customer journey a little bit. We'll look at, defining identity in the digital age. And all of that is exactly table setting before we dive into those 3 actionable tactics that we really believe can make a huge difference to your fraud prevention strategy. And without further ado, let's dive in. So again, really wanted to start this conversation. I know you all are living this every day, right? What's happening in fraud in the e-commerce space. And I think we'd be remiss not to start this conversation by, naming the elephant in the room that, of course, so many transactions moved online at the beginning of the pandemic. We saw that huge uptick in 2020. And most of those are not going away. We're not seeing that huge growth year over year anymore, but we're still seeing sizable growth. We're still seeing a lot more customers transacting online rather than going into brick and mortar stores. And I bring that up because I think that really, as I'm sure you all are aware, really changes the game with how we actually address fraud. It's very different addressing it online than it is in store. And how do you make that scalable, knowing that it's just going to continue to grow? And so I wanted to just dive into a couple, specific types of fraud as well. I threw promo fraud up here with that stat. 89 billion is a big number. And I think it is interesting to talk about in this context, because I think historically, understandably, e-commerce companies have not really, they mostly just viewed promo fraud as cost of doing business, right? You're spending a ton of marketing dollars to get new customers through the door, to capture their email address, their identity information, so you can add them to your mailing lists and get them forever closer to that transaction step. But with this continuing move online, it's clear that fraudsters are starting to see that promo abuse, that $5 coupon you're offering, or referral codes for $25 for you and a friend. They're starting to see that as an opportunity as well, to really get into your ecosystem and take advantage of those marketing spend, leaving you with really reduced ROI, just things that really hurt your bottom line. And so it starts to ask the question, how do e-commerce companies start to address things like promo fraud, knowing that there really still isn't an appetite to add friction at account opening, understandably. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then the second piece I want to talk about here about synthetic IDs. I feel like synthetic ID, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is kind of collating a lot of different real identity elements, like somebody's real email address, real name, pulling them together into what is actually, a fake identity. I feel like that term has historically really mostly resonated in the financial services industry. It hasn't been as big of a keyword in e-commerce. And I think with this move to digital, it's becoming more so. One, because again, fraudsters are always innovating. They're figuring out that developing these synthetic IDs will give them the chance to make bigger transactions down the road because you trust them. And so it's starting to figure out, how do we craft fraud prevention, metrics and strategies that address that as well. And the last piece I want to talk about before, Alex, I'll throw it to you because I'm sure you have some things to add, is of course, chargebacks. We're seeing that becoming a $125 billion problem, where $100 lost is actually worth closer to $240. In Europe, of course, chargebacks and transaction fraud are really starting to fall with the implementation of PSD2 and SCA, but the same doesn't hold true in the US. So we're left figuring out how do we implement new strategies to combat this without the help of that type of legislation. Yeah, Alex, anything you would like to add there?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that you said is absolutely on point. And I think that it's important that merchants understand that when we deal with, so I'll go back to the promo fraud. One thing that we've been seeing across the board is, otherwise, what would otherwise be good customers abusing promotion systems as well. We've seen people who, in their, call it desperation because of the events leading from 2020, they see opportunity where there wasn't before, or they see necessity where there wasn't before. And so they're willing to take advantage of these different situations, these different offerings, like the promo abuse and promotion abuse, policy abuse, things like that. The thing that makes it interesting to me is the fact that these, like you said, are not represented in chargebacks. It's not stolen card information. It's not illegal, right? Practices that are represented in chargebacks. So what we have to do is start to look at the performance of these platforms overall, and note spikes, note abusers, and of course, fraudsters are taking advantage of it. And for the customers who are being dishonest, we don't want to throw them away for the entire life. We don't want to lose the lifespan of their engagement. But it is important that we understand where these losses are categorized and how to monitor them. Second to that, the synthetic IDs. That's something I can speak to forever. And yeah, everything that you said is absolutely on point. Synthetic IDs are growing. The more breaches and ransomware attacks that we see, the more personal PII information that's being leaked to the public. Fraudsters are definitely eating it up, manipulating it, and employing it against all the merchants and service providers out there. Definitely something we need to focus on. Yeah, I'll pass it back to you with that.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. And yeah, I think that's a great call out about the fact that promo fraud is not just fraudsters anymore. And how do we navigate that, knowing that sometimes they're good customers we don't fully want to lose. I wanted to throw this slide up here. I know you're all aware, everyone in the audience is aware of the customer journey. This is a very abbreviated, high level view of it. There's obviously a lot more nuance, a lot more touch points in the customer journey, especially in the digital realm. But I do it because I think that it helps further set the stage for what I think is going to be a huge theme of this webinar. And that is that companies can no longer afford to not take a holistic approach to fraud prevention. I think, again, historically, fraud has really been kind of keyed into that transaction stage. Like Alex said, chargebacks have a very clear, loss and value attached to them. So of course, that is where we're seeing a lot of fraud prevention effort being put. But like we were saying on the other slide, I think fraudsters are starting to find other weak spots. They're trying to figure out how else to get into your ecosystem, how else to start building trust, to making you believe that their identity is that of a good customer, so that by the time they get to that transaction stage or that loyalty stage, you're no longer thinking to look at them as a risky customer until suddenly, a big fraud attack and a big fraud event happens. And I think it's just really, really key to start asking the question of where else can we put effort to perform, maybe higher level risk assessments, low friction risk assessments, to start turning that customer journey instead of, a single line that everybody goes down, but instead customized. So we're seeing multiple branches depending on risk at every step of the journey. Anything to add there, Alex?
Absolutely. Yeah. Speaking about every touch point in the customer journey, it's important to understand what kind of methods fraudsters will employ against them. If we consider, from the moment a user touches down, a user, yet undefined if it's a customer or a fraudster. When the user first touches down, you're starting to aggregate session data. So that might be IP address, that might be MAC address, it might be behavioral analytics. Moving on to the sign up is where something gets assigned to, email address, phone number, and so on. And then again, with the promotion abuse, taking advantage of first-time users at the account sign-on, past that, transactions using stolen ACH, using stolen credit cards, whatever it might be, using gift cards that have been stolen. The overarching story here is there are methods that exist at every touch point across the customer experience journey, and there's different data sets that are available. There's different pieces of data that are available with every touch point and every interaction that a user has with your website or your app. So it's important to have staff who's knowledgeable in these methods, who knows how to read the data and knows how to see when these attempts are being made against your system. And yes, holistically is the only way to go about it, and it needs to consider every touch point.
Yeah, I think that's super well said, and I think leads us into this next slide really well. Asking the question, what is identity? And I mean that in the sense of identity is no longer a customer walking into a brick and mortar location and having their face available to the checkout clerk, having their license available to pair with a credit card. So what does that leave us with in the digital age when we're trying to verify identity and build trust without ever seeing somebody face to face? And I think, Alex, what you said about, there's different data available at every touch point in the customer journey is so relevant here, because when I talk about identity, when Ekata talks about identity, we're on the whole really talking about 5 key elements here, right? Name, email, phone, IP, and address, and how those operate in the physical and digital world. And as we know, you don't necessarily have all 5 of those elements throughout the entire journey. You might start with just an email address at sign up or to get on your mailing list, and then add name, add phone later. You might never get all 5 of them. And it's starting to ask how do we build trust based on those 5 identity elements? How do we, and you're talking about device elements as well, Alex. How do we incorporate those as well to make risk assessments to build that trust with a customer? And I think that this is a key point to point out that, it's just as important to have to utilize, your in-house data. Obviously, your customers are giving you a lot of data. How do you use that? Are they a return customer? That obviously bolsters your belief that that transaction is going to be good. But how do you also then overlay that with third-party data that gives you a broader scope? Like, for instance, the Ekata Identity Engine, our graph sees more than 1 billion global identities, where our network is churning through 200 million monthly anonymized queries to show you how that name is being used in the digital world, how that email is being used. And all of this is just more data to really help you determine, is this person's identity true? Can I trust it? And then can I send them down that path to transaction with confidence?
Yeah, I want to continue with your example that you showed on the last slide, where the physical in-person engagement is taken away. Right now, because everyone in the world is typically very familiar with this, we can see if someone acts sketchy. We can see if someone's face doesn't match the ID. We have all of these different, well, they are data points. We have all these different inputs that we can based on performance and all that. And moving over to a digital world might seem intimidating at first, but when you understand that when you're leveraging an expansive merchant network or a global network, what you end up with is the ability to see how that person or that user has interacted with many merchants over time. It's more empowering. You have more data to go off of, and understanding what the data means to you and your operation is just going to give you the heightened ability to give you an accurate determination quicker, because you'll be able to see how these data elements performed across the network instead of just one engagement. So that's one thing that I say to merchants when making the shift from brick and mortar to e-commerce is you have a vast wealth of data points over here that give you so much more information. So not to be too intimidated when you step from one world into the next. So yeah, I wanted to drive that home.
Yeah, that's very true. Thank you. And so now that we've kind of set the table with the landscape we're operating in, Alex and I want to dive into those 3 actual tactics. And where it starts, again, alluding to that holistic approach, is really at sign up. There's a big opportunity there to really set your company up for success with determining confidently the risk associated with the customers coming through your door. And so I think that the key piece to really key in on here, there are kind of 2. One, by starting at sign up, by taking in those limited identity elements. Again, perhaps you're only capturing email address and IP address. You're obviously not going to be able to do a super comprehensive risk assessment. You don't even want to do that, right? Because that adds friction, that keeps potential good customers out of your platform. And so instead, what you're doing is gathering that information and performing really high level risk assessments that are really only, helping you flag, is this user likely risky? Are they likely a good customer? And by flagging them, you can start, again, building those custom pathways. So whereas a good customer, somebody who gets flagged at sign up as likely low risk, their email address, IP address, nothing pings as risky, you are able to set them down that really frictionless path towards transaction, because you want good customers transacting. Whereas somebody who gets flagged as high risk, you can set them down a higher friction path. Perhaps you ask for more information before they're able to transact. Perhaps you set a limit on the dollar value that they're able to transact with for their first purchase or their first month's purchases, until you're able to gather enough information that you can either put them fully in a fraudster bucket and keep them off, or you can move them into that good customer bucket. And the pieces, the really tactical pieces I want to talk about on this slide are how do you do that, right? Again, very limited identity elements that you're getting at sign up. And I think that this is a multi-step approach, right? So let's say you decide to start performing these high-level risk assessments at sign up. You flag customers coming through your door, you let them through. And then the next stage of that is to actually, validate fraud at the transaction step. And what that allows you to do is to start building those risk models that will be able to work off of just that email address and IP address. And then the next step is to, take the time from some people on your team to perform manual reviews of, subpopulations of the people moving through that sign up to transaction stage, to really refine those risk models to see what we're capturing, what we're not capturing at sign up. And I think that ultimately what this allows you to do, right, it enables you to send those customers down different paths according to risk. And it also, and Alex, you said this brilliantly on this last slide, the beauty of e-commerce is there's so much data to use. And so of course, capturing more data upfront at sign up simply allows you and enables you to perform more confident risk assessments and decisions at the transaction stage and further, because you did that upfront work to start building out that risk decision. Anything to add there, Alex?
The one thing that I think is critical here is understanding the difference between an in-house data set and leveraging a collective, collaborative, aggregated data set. Consider that this user in this hypothetical here, consider that the user, this is their first time interacting with your website. This is the first time that they touch down, the first time you've seen this IP address, the first time you've seen the email, phone number, first, last name. If this is the first time, how could you make a decision by leveraging the information that's only in your system, that's already in your system historically? Well, you can't make very accurate determinations using in-house information when this is a new user. And that's why, again, it's very important to, in my opinion, it's very important to expand our data sets to include aggregated data sets that are across the merchant or global network. That way, again, like we said before, that way you can see how this user has interacted, how this collective set of data points have interacted with different merchants across the network, if this can be seen as reliable or not. And as Megan was saying early on, if you grab those data points and you check it against the merchant or the global network, you'll be able to see quickly they've performed well with this data set, or you'll be able to say, hey, this email address has never been seen with these data points before. This phone number has never been seen, this name, whatever it might be. You'll be able to see where things differentiate, but you'll also be able to see where things line up. And as long as your team is able to see these in action, you'll be able to make early, accurate determinations, thus lowering the friction rate. And then to Megan's point as well, that's when you can introduce escalation processes. Maybe you don't want to completely alienate someone because they typed in a short name, Alec instead of Alexander, or, Mike instead of Michael. Maybe you don't want to alienate them automatically. Maybe put them through an escalation and see what the difference is. But it opens up all these new paths, these journeys that you were speaking to. So I think, yeah, that's very important.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, Alex, that's so right about third-party data sets. And I think that also this is just a really key, the first theme, is having a holistic view. And I think that this slide really keys in on that second theme, which is just how important identity elements and their behavior out in the world is to actually being able to make accurate and confident risk decisions. And that really clearly leads us into the second tactic, right? Which is building strong transaction risk profiles. And this is really building on that initial, risk assessment identity elements you captured at sign up. And to start at the transaction stage, you of course are getting a lot more information. You're getting a physical address, which as we know is a lot harder to just create. It's not the same as an email address where you can very easily and quickly create hundreds of them. A physical address is much harder to do that type of thing with. And so you're getting a lot stronger identity elements at this stage. And so the question is, how do you weave those into this profile? And I think it's very similar to what Alex was talking about on the last slide, and begs the question of, internal data versus third party. Because often at the transaction stage, you probably will have a lot more internal data to work with. There's a good chance that they might be a repeat customer, which is often, of course, a good indicator that they're likely not going to be a risky transaction to let through. You might have seen just how long they've been on your platform. There's a lot more information you have internally. And that said, that doesn't mean that often that is enough. Not in an age of increasingly sophisticated fraudsters who know how to learn a platform's risk decisioning and circumvent it and get around it. And so one of the ways to do that is, again, to pull in those third-party data sources. And I think it's a key point here is that one of the beauties of third-party data is that it also often isn't siloed to an industry. Akata, for example, we're not only pulling transaction data from e-commerce sites, we're also looking at financial services, payments for all types of industries. And so what you're getting is, again, that keyword holistic, a really holistic view of how those data identity data elements are being used. For instance, if we're looking at a physical address and we see that it's gotten, 100+ transactions in the last 30 days, I am a relatively prolific online shopper. And even for me, that number would be exceedingly high, right? And it, of course, varies depending on your business and the rule sets you make. But you start to see how you can build risk assessment by being able to see all of those elements out in the wild, how they're behaving and how they're behaving with each other. Has that address been, paired with 20 different email addresses? Has it been paired with 50 different names? All of that information is just enabling you to build a stronger risk profile. So that, does this need to be sent to manual review? Should we just be automating the denial of it? Should we be letting it through? And really building strong rule sets based on comprehensive data that helps you avoid fraud, avoid chargebacks, things along those lines.
Absolutely. That was very articulated very well. And it reminded me of two use cases. I'll bring up one. When we talk about thresholds, rule sets, and we talk about in-house data, which is typical of someone who's been trying to get fraud prevention done by themselves for themselves in-house. That's a typical setup that exists. And as you mentioned, fraudsters are going to go out and they're going to find out where these thresholds are. They're going to find out what it takes to make it through the rule sets. And then in addition to that, now with the explosion that we've seen of ATOs, we see that people will hijack established accounts that have good spending history, X, Y, and Z, checks all the boxes, so to speak, and they'll input a new credit card. They'll input a new shipping address. Maybe they'll hijack the account and put in new email address or contact information. again, if all we're doing is looking at good transaction history and allowing all future transactions to go through, that will work X amount of the time. But for the Y amount of time, we need to be able to leverage new data sets. So for example, if we came in and we established a rule that if this account goes through an address change, well, let's just see what that address change is, see if it lines up in the system by leveraging these third-party data sets. If it's accessed by a new IP address or a new device ID, we need to check those types of things. In today's world, ATOs are becoming, well, they're definitely more prominent than they were several years ago. So that would just be one example, is defending against ATOs for established accounts by leveraging third-party data sets when these changes happen. I think that's important in today's landscape with the ATOs going on. So just wanted to add that.
No, that's a great example. Thank you, Alex. Okay, and then to wrap with our third tactic, which is employing manual review. And we include this here because, of course, I assume all of you have manual review teams already involved in this process. But I think that, you know, as we talk about e-commerce, how it's growing, how we need scalability, and understandably, so much of the emphasis is on automation. How do we, exactly, Alex, build those rule sets that account for A, B, C through Z scenarios so that we never have to divert somebody to a manual review agent. And while that makes sense, I think it's really important to also you know, understand that there will just always be a place for manual review in this process. There will always be gray area. There will always be edge cases in which having an actual human to review the data, review the transaction, and hopefully you've taken in that data at sign up. You've built that transaction risk profile, so they have a lot to work with. Because we want to avoid false positives, right? That's kind of the other through line here. You're spending a lot of money to get customers through the door. You're automating in ways that are hopefully not having good customers fall off. And so we don't want to stumble at the finish line. We don't want to build rule sets that are so strict that there is no room for that gray area, so that anybody who seems even remotely risky, according to, of course, your company's appetite, gets thrown off the path and isn't allowed to transact. And that's often where those manual review agents come in and step in. It's a little more friction, but it helps ensure that you're not losing out on business. And I think the last thing I want to say there is that, you know, when we talk about scalability, again, we talk about automation, but I think that it's just as important to talk about scalability when we talk about the manual portion of this journey. And I think that one of the ways you do that is you give your agents the tools they need to be more scalable with review cycles. You give them something like, you know, Akata has Pro Insight, our SaaS tool, which really collates onto one dashboard all of that PII, all those identity elements, the behavior, risk scores, etc. Instead of leaving your review agents to Google and go on the internet and try and see, is this person real? Is their identity something that we can trust to send through transaction? And by doing that, by having the tools that support a manual review process, you are able to tighten that up as well, and to ensure that it is a scalable part of the process as much as your automations and your rule sets are.
Yeah, very well said. Talking about manual review, and I'm sure you agree, this is a huge topic. There's plenty to be said. And my advice to merchants is for two things. One, empower your manual review teams to be trained, to be up to date, to understand what different vulnerabilities look like across, you know, your industry or across, you know, similar service providers, whatever it might be. Two, is avoid siloing your fraud prevention. Your fraud prevention should not only live at, as we've said this whole time, your fraud prevention team should not only have influence over your checkout form, over at the point of checkout. They need to have access to the data points that are available at user touchdown, account creation, customer service, the sales team. We need to deal with chargebacks, and they have to have at least some sort of interaction with the chargeback team in order to form these winning representments. And all of this is predicated on the need for expansive data. That's what everything boils back to. The more data you have, the more accurate your determinations can be. And by removing your fraud prevention team from these silos, they'll be able to go step into other departments and work with them in order to make sure that these escalation processes are put in place, and that they know what vulnerabilities and methods to be watching for, what data points to leverage, and how to respond accordingly.
Yeah, I think that is so very accurate, and I think that it really leads into kind of wrapping this up for the key takeaways from this webinar. Alex and I have both really dug into the need for a holistic approach, and that yes applies both in the automation world, taking in more identity elements throughout the customer journey, performing more risk assessments at more touch points. And it also, yeah, exactly applies to where the fraud prevention team needs to be brought in and part of that conversation. Because in this era of digital and of e-commerce, it's not enough anymore to focus only on transactions. Fraudsters are too sophisticated. There's too many entry points and weak spots if you're only putting all of your effort at that stage. And then the last piece, which Alex has very eloquently stated, is just continues to be that data, identity data, and that's both what you're pulling in-house as well as what you're able to get from third-party data sets, is really paramount to being able to build out fraud prevention strategies that you can then actually act on with confidence, because you are able to see the full digital identity of that person, verifying they are who they are, and also that their elements, their identity is behaving out in the world like a real person would. And it's really, yeah, those two key points. We provided the actionable steps, started account sign up, build transaction risk profiles, still employ manual review. But I think that all three of those kind of fall under, or actually stand on top of, this foundational piece of holistic approach and implementing and using as much data as you can.
That was beautiful. I have nothing to add there.
Thank you, Alex. I always want to present with you. I love when my co-presenters say my talking is beautiful. And then yeah, I will actually pull down this. I'll stop sharing my screen, but if there are any questions from the audience, Alex and I would love to be able to answer them and to continue this conversation.
So we do have one question right off the bat here from Randall. He says, we see layoffs occurring in the fintech and fraud prevention industry, and e-commerce volume is still high. Any thoughts on the reasons companies are reducing their fraud prevention power? And something I want to add to this question is, how do you guys see companies being able to get more efficiency out of their current fraud prevention setups?
Yeah, I'll kick it off, and then Alex, I'm sure you'll have some great stuff to add. I think historically, and I'm sure many of the people on this call are in the fraud prevention space, I think fraud prevention is still seen as a cost center on the whole. And so I think that when companies are seeing, are doing layoffs, et cetera, it sometimes becomes easier to lay off the people in, a cost center versus something that they perceive as adding value. And so I do think that there is an argument to be made for how do you advocate internally we all know how important fraud prevention is, and that it obviously adds to the bottom line. It ensures good customers are getting through. It ensures fraudsters aren't. But I think that the question is, how do you start internally advocating for that same knowledge across company for the people who are making those decisions? And I think the second piece, Bradley, more to your point, is, I mean, I think that one of those pieces is how manual review teams are, I think it's mostly about finding an even finer balance sometimes between automation and manual review. How do you save that team from having to spend, a lot of man hours doing manual review by creating stronger rule sets that are starting to really sort out risk before they even get to that team? I think that's a pretty key piece of keeping costs lower and using what you already have to have a stronger setup.
Yeah, I couldn't agree better, or couldn't agree more. And the idea, the way that you said about it's easier to lay off cost centers. It's a sad truth. It really is. We need to learn how to justify our findings. We need to learn how to report up the line and make sure that they understand that, hey, without these costs and these manual reviews and all of these escalations and some drawn out processes exist, of course. Without these, we'd be in a completely different boat. We need to justify that going up. And I know that's always been the story. It's nothing new, but we need to be able to justify that going up the chain. Secondarily, to Bradley's point, in my eyes, the truth is any fraud prevention strategy is incomplete if once you're cruising and you've got volume going. It's incomplete if you do not have staff in-house handling tools, like Ekata. If you simply rely on tools, you won't get the best of both worlds. If you simply rely on in-house, you won't get the best of both worlds. You won't have the best strategy possible. And the thing is, the benefit of employing these tools, these automation vendors, is it allows you to do more work with less manpower. So then you can use less manpower in-house to manage the tools. Without going into specific use cases or specific company, hierarchies and all the elements that build up their staff and personnel, I would venture to guess that what's happening is in-house staff is getting shortened while automation vendors are being employed. And I think it's not good for the in-house analysts, and I understand that, but I think that's the course of action that should be expected. If an automated vendor does great work, we need less manual review here. One person can do more work, so on and so forth. So it's not cool, but that's my 2 cents.
All right, awesome. So we have another question here. Which are the main loopholes for ATO situations and best practices in the current digital market? And this is definitely another one of the hot topics that we're seeing so many more instances of account takeover fraud, because the number of vectors and the attack surface is just gigantic. But if you had to give 1 to 3 of the main loopholes, what would they be?
I would say, okay, I can definitely speak to this. Hijacked and compromised identity information can be used in conjunction with like social engineering to talk to any customer facing representative. Social engineering means that you're telling a story, you're trying to twist the person to your will. The story that I always give is, hey, I lost access to this account. Here's the social security number. Here's the name. Here's the address, blah, 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 blah. My goldfish died and my dog ate my phone. I need a new email address associated, new phone number, and I'm going to be out of town for 2 weeks. Let's associate a new address. Now, that's a pretty big example, but the idea is the same. Taking hijacked and compromised profile information to a customer-facing representative, whether it's customer service or sales team, and working your magic. The truth is, they are incentivized to give the best service to these users, but they don't yet know how to define whether or not a user is a good customer or a fraudster. So without that ability, that's definitely a high vulnerability that I point out is the customer interaction social engineering and using hijacked or compromised profile information.
Yeah, and I think one other thing to add, even though I'm not going to be able to top my goldfish, died, my dog ate my phone. I think the one other thing to bring up, and for those of us with kind of more of a global view, we're obviously seeing strong customer authentication in Europe, right? And so we're seeing a lot more of that two-factor authentication being used on the e-commerce side as well as financial services. They're sending a code to your phone to verify you are who you are. And that, like I alluded to earlier, we're seeing a lot of fraud drop off because of that, at least at that stage. And it's not, and because the US doesn't have that, because customers in the US don't expect two-factor authentication, especially for a transaction, they expect a pretty frictionless experience, right? That really gives fraudsters a way to get in, because if they can just guess, get the email address and start guessing passwords or reset passwords because they have exactly access to your email address already and they figured out how to get into there. That really gives them that way in to start using your account, maybe using your loyalty points too. That's of course an increasing type of fraud that we're seeing. And just yeah, and so I think that is a piece to consider. Do you introduce something like two-factor for the customers that you are seeing as more potentially risky because perhaps you spotted their IP address at sign-in and you're like, that doesn't seem like that matches up where we're usually seeing that. And it begs the question, do you start doing more things behind the scenes at sign-up or at sign-in to determine risk? And I think that is a newer question that's being asked as we see the rise of ATO, and it will probably continue to be asked and to be implemented.
All right, so we have another question. This one directly about Ekata. Would you say Ekata will help minimize the need to contact the customer for verification a lot? Currently using another solution provider, we hit customers hard with a lot of emails and marketing calls right after purchase, and I'm hesitant to reach out and add friction to the journey.
I mean, I think the broader question is actually about risk appetite at your company, and how do you build rules that really lend themselves to that journey? So for instance, Ekata is going to be able to look at all of that information you're getting at transaction, address, IP, name, email, phone, anything that you're taking in. And we're going to be able to return risk scores. We're going to be able to return behavioral data. Like I brought up earlier, maybe that address has been seen 100 times in the last 30 days. And while all of that is getting ingested potentially into the rule set that your company uses to determine whether or not somebody needs to be reached out to during transaction or directly afterwards. The important thing to, I think, note there is that you are able to, because all of those data points, all of that kind of analysis is, it's not in a black box. You can keep pulling levers based on all of it. You can decide that email address is the most important thing, or physical address. And I think that really falls to fraud prevention teams and leadership to determine, is it more worthwhile for us to ensure risk isn't happening or fraud isn't happening, or is it more worthwhile for us to not be contacting customers as much? And I think that's always the balance. That's what kind of this webinar is about, right? Like, I think that we're all always going to be walking that tightrope, and it's always going to be a little tricky. And I think it's just, how do we pull levers? How do we test out new things to determine what's causing customer drop off and what's actually successfully keeping fraud off a platform without causing that?
Alex, I just want you to jump in here and give us your opinion on these manual verification methods, because I know you have a lot of experience on this.
What part of it? What do you mean?
Just how effective they are when people are trying to make these determinations of adding friction into the customer experience in the name of trying to prevent some of the fraud that's coming through. In your experience, if you could ballpark kind of how effective you see these types of methodologies being, if they're worth the amount of friction that they're going to create, and maybe how you can try to minimize the amount of verification that you have to do to be effective, or another way to put it would be, what's the minimum amount of verification that you can do that you would still consider to be having some kind of effect on the fraud rate?
Got it. Okay, so there's 3 points talking about it generally. One, people are not just people, right? When you're dealing, if you're a vape shop, you're dealing with millennials, you're dealing with Generation Y or whatever it is. If you're dealing with car companies, you're dealing with people who are, more set in their ways and spending big dollar items. If you're in fintech, you're dealing with financial, credit lines, you're dealing with bank accounts and stuff like this. The point is, all the demographics that people deal with are different people of different age groups in different scenarios expect different sets of friction. If I call into my bank from a new phone and I say, hey, I need to change my contact information, blah, 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 and they just do it, well, I'm going to be mad at that because that was way too easy. Now, if I go over to some, website selling shirts and they put me through the ringer and I have to go through a credit check in order to change my information or to reset a password. Okay, those are the two pendulum points, we'll say. So one is take into consideration the demographic of people that you're working with based on different variables: age, price range, your setting in the marketplace, so on and so forth. Two, make sure that your data is on point. The one thing that fraud prevention is predicated on is the more data you have, the more heightened your ability to make accurate determinations is. And of all the data sets, the one that is the most expansive and the most easily translated into actionable processes and actionable terms is PII. If you want to go talk about behavioral analytics, if you want to go talk about biometrics, if you want to go talk about device fingerprinting and IP address, proxies and all this stuff, those are all valuable, don't get me wrong. But to the typical fraud prevention analyst, it's easier to look at PII and go through a KYC process in order to make a determination, because we understand the information. We all have the same types of information, so we're familiar with it. So that's two, expand your data set. And of course, I'm an advocate for PII for your KYC practices. And then three is monitor your performance over time. The third point is make sure that you don't know straight out the gate exactly what's going to be right for the demographic of people you're working with, for your positioning in the marketplace, for your risk appetite, as Megan was saying. I love that. You don't know, and it will evolve. So be nimble, be dynamic, be available to track performance and make adjustments as you see might be needed. I can't get more granular than that because, of course, every merchant that's on this call has a different story to tell. That's where consulting comes in.
Excellent plug.
I love it. I just dropped in the discussion for anyone who wants to check it out. Alex wrote a great article for us a little while ago about data lakes and how you can use your data effectively organizationally in fraud prevention. So definitely check that out. And yeah, get in touch with them if you want to know more. So we have a couple more questions here. One is, do you anticipate these data points will continue to be largely available to merchants and fraud investigators, i.e. changes in privacy legislation? Is that at all a concern? Are there any concerns in relation to customers' privacy and balancing that, customers' privacy and balancing that with protection or protecting them / us from fraud?
Yeah, I mean, I think I know I've brought up, of course, Europe and PSD2 a few times already, but I do think it continues to be really relevant here. I think Europe is ahead of the US when it comes to privacy and protecting identity. And I think I bring it up because Akata is still doing business in Europe, right? Like we're still able to support companies when it comes to using those identity elements to make risk decisions. And I think a piece of that is that a couple things. One, Akata made the decision from the outset, we don't sell any data. We only ingest it in our models to be able to provide scores, et cetera, back to customers. And I think that's a really key piece. I think the question is actually, how are you using the data? Like if you are also selling it, if you're capturing it and then selling it, I can't speak to that. That might change. There's a good chance that will change. If you're using it and keeping it in-house or only pulling in and also using like third-party data, risk scores from it to make risk decisions, we're not seeing that change necessarily in Europe right now. And so I think, and perhaps, who knows, maybe 5 years from now, I'll be like, that was a foot and mouth situation. But I think we have a pretty long runway in the US and probably in Europe before we see any changes that would actually impact the strategies, the fraud prevention strategies that you're implementing today to use identity elements like that.
That was perfectly
Awesome.
stated. The long runway was definitely better than the way I would have put it. Yes, we're going to have this for a while. Merchants, FIs, well, not necessarily FIs because the PCI compliance and all that, but the people who do employ these different data sets, the different touch points, it's important. There's a good argument to be had because some people will say it's good to know what data went into the determination process. How far can I drill down? How far can I reference? And the other side just says, hey, I just want a risk score. If you tell me it's bad, I'll move on to the next one. Both arguments are correct. There's, you know, it's all up to how you want to operate. But no, to your point, Megan, I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. Yeah.
I also want to mention, we just published an article, which I just shared also in the chat, that PSD3 is in the works. The European Commission recently launched 3 consultation documents for stakeholders to provide feedback. So I shared that in the chat. You can check that out. You can jump in and give your 2 cents there if you want to, but also just check out where the discussion is going, and we'll wait to see where that goes in the future. One more question here to close out the hour. And this is for Megan. What makes your service superior to other services that are out there? Great question. You want to talk about a plug? There you go. We end with the massive mic drop plug. Go for it.
I love it. This is the difference between a marketing person and a salesperson, though. I feel like my salespeople would be just going in and marketing. I'm like, how do we, I think it's, I think the real answer is that we provide slightly different services. I think that like Signified, et cetera, they are really platforms, like fraud prevention platforms for you to implement, tools for you to implement at your company. Akata we are, an identity data like provider, like services provider. So we're not a plug and play platform. We're instead, we often work with companies whose fraud prevention teams are sophisticated enough that they know how to pull in third-party data. They have data scientists on their team who are able to work with us and our data scientist team to figure out what rules make sense based on the data that they're pulling in, based on their industry, the populations transacting with them. And I think that's really the big differentiator. And I do think the way that Akata stands out in the field is we take in a lot of data. I mentioned earlier, over 1 billion identities globally. We're taking in 250 million anonymized real world transactions every month, which means that our our risk scores that we return, our information that we return about identity elements is always up to date. We're not waiting like a month or two out to aggregate. So you're actually capturing fraudulent accounts after the fact. Because we're doing it in real time and constantly updating, we're able to help you actually, for someone transacting today, we can actually show you how often that email address was used from today through 90 days ago, instead of, 90 days ago to 180 days ago, which I think is really key and powerful with the speed and the rapidity with which fraudsters ingest data elements and then go out and use them. You need that kind of real-time information.
And Megan, I assume that anyone who wants to speak with your sales team can just get in touch. I'm sure they'd be happy to talk. All right. Well, this has been an amazing discussion. I really appreciate it. Megan and Alex, thank you. Why don't you each let us know where we can find you on the web, and then we will call it an event.
Thank you. Yeah, you can find us at, akata.com. We have contact forms on our website, a lot of information, and I am pretty confident you will probably be hearing from us after this with just some more information. We have a promo fraud ebook that is pretty informative and dives pretty deep that we will likely be sending out after this. So very easy to get in touch with us, and we look forward to hopefully hearing from you.
And I'm primarily on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn, Alexander Hall at Dispute Defense. Dispute Defense Consulting has LinkedIn. I have disputedefenseconsulting.com. Yeah, I love having conversations. So feel free to reach out.
Amazing. And we hope you guys will also be present on our site, in the Slack group, on the podcast. We love to get in touch, meet with you. Feel free to drop me a line at any time you want. And yeah, thank you guys so much for an amazing discussion on a very important topic. And we look forward to having you again sometime in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
All right, take care.